My son looked me in the eyes and said, I wouldn't get a penny from his inheritance. Not a cent. Not after everything I had given him. Not after every sacrifice I made so he could have a better life. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just smiled, because by then the papers were already in my lawyer's hands. Papers that would change everything. You see, when someone thinks they've locked you out, they forget. You still have the keys to the doors they don't even see, and I was about to open one that would leave him with nothing but regret. Some people believe betrayal is the end of the story, but sometimes it's just the opening act, because this wasn't about money anymore, this was about dignity, about making sure he learned the cost of trying to erase the very person who built his future. And what happened next? Well, let's just say it's a lesson he'll never forget. Before we continue, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. The pen tapped against the table in a slow, steady rhythm, like a countdown to something I couldn't yet see, but knew was coming. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of leather and dust, heavy with the scent of paper that had been sitting too long in drawers. A neat stack of documents lay in front of my son, angled toward him like loyal soldiers awaiting orders. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, and smiled. That same smile he wore as a boy when he thought he'd gotten away with something. Only this time, the stakes were far bigger than a broken vase or stolen cookie. I'm just making sure everything is protected, he said, glancing toward our relatives seated along the wall. His voice was calm, calculated. The assets are safer in my hands. She's not in a position to manage them. The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were untrue, but because they were deliberate, meant to wound, meant to humiliate. I kept my hands folded in my lap, still, controlled. My lawyer's warning echoed in my head. Let him talk. Let him show his hand. He slid a paper across the table toward the attorney. Once these are finalized, there's no confusion. Everything comes to me. That way there's no risk. Risk. That's what I had become to him. Not a mother, not the woman who kept a roof over his head when the bank came knocking. Just risk. I glanced at the will sitting between us. Its clean, crisp pages looked harmless enough, but I knew better. Words on that paper could erase decades of sacrifice. Flashback. I saw myself standing in the rain 20 years ago, a grocery bag splitting in my hands, because I couldn't afford more than one. My fingers numb, my shoes soaked through, but smiling as I stepped into the apartment with his favorite stew ingredients. He had been studying for exams, and I wanted him to feel cared for. Back in the present, his voice snapped me out of the memory. This is the best decision for the family. I nearly laughed at the hypocrisy of the word family on his lips. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, do you have anything you wish to add before we proceed? I shook my head. Not yet. My silence wasn't weakness. It was ammunition. He leaned forward, clasping his hands, eyes glinting with something smug. Good. Then we can move ahead. Flashback. I remembered selling my wedding ring after his father died. I told him it was for a repair on the car, but in truth, it paid for his first semester of college. I never told him the truth. I didn't want him to carry the weight of that choice. Present. The papers shuffled, the sound crisp and final like a door closing. My fingers itched to reach across the table and tear them apart, but I didn't need to. I had already taken my first step weeks ago, when I found something he didn't know existed. He thought he was locking me out, but the lock was already broken. I let him keep talking, weaving his own rope one word at a time. The room felt colder now, not from the air but from the way every relative avoided my eyes, pretending not to see the quiet theft taking place in plain sight. I smiled, a small controlled curve of my lips. He didn't notice. Not yet. But he would. Because by the time he realized what I'd done, it would be too late. 20 years before that cold morning in the lawyer's office, my world had already been stripped bare. I had just buried my husband. The air still carried the scent of fresh earth from the grave, and the silence in our small apartment felt heavier than the casket we'd lowered into the ground. My son was barely a teenager, staring at me with eyes that searched for answers I didn't have. The bills came fast, faster than the condolences faded. I remember opening the velvet box that held my wedding necklace, the one my husband had saved for months to buy. My fingers lingered on the clasp, the metal warm from my touch. I took it to the pawn shop and watched the man weigh my memories on a cold steel scale. The money wasn't much, but it paid for my son's first term at a better school. At night, the sewing machine was my lifeline. The hum of its motor filled the darkness as I mended torn coats for neighbors. My hands ached, fingertips raw, but each coin I earned went into a tin box under the bed. The future I was building for him, one stitch at a time. I still see the light in his eyes the day I handed him the envelope for the school trip everyone else's parents could afford. He didn't ask how I managed it. He just hugged me, his arms thin but strong, his head pressing against my chest like he belonged there forever. Years blurred into seasons. I patched clothes, skipped meals, and worked overtime in an office that smelled of stale coffee and cheap perfume, all so he could walk into classrooms where the teachers saw potential, not poverty. And then came the graduation. The gymnasium was packed, the air thick with the scent of flowers and freshly ironed gowns. My seat was in the back. I couldn't afford the fancy family section, but I had the best view in the world. My son stepped onto the stage, his gown swaying, the tassel on his cap brushing against his cheek. When they called his name, I clapped until my palms stung. My eyes blurred, but I didn't wipe the tears. I wanted to see the moment through the haze, to remember it exactly as it was, the moment I thought every sacrifice had been worth it. He looked out over the crowd, and for a second, I thought our eyes met. I thought he smiled at me. Back in the present, sitting across from him in that lawyer's office years later, I realized how wrong I'd been about that smile, because love can turn cold without warning, and what I didn't know then was that the seeds of my greatest betrayal were already planted. The café was warm, but the moment I saw him, a chill ran through me. He had chosen a corner table, sunlight spilling across the polished wood, turning the coffee in his cup a deep amber. The hum of quiet conversations filled the air, but between us there was only silence. He didn't stand when I arrived, just waved me over like I was an appointment he was late for. I walked across the room slowly, feeling the weight of his eyes tracking me. My coat brushed against my knees, the scent of cinnamon rolls drifting in the air. When I sat, the chair creaked softly, and I placed my hands on the table to steady myself. He started with small talk. The weather, his new car, a neighbor who'd sold their house. His voice was too even, too careful, like someone rehearsing lines. I sipped the tea. The waitress sat down in front of me, steam curled upward, blurring my view of him for a moment. Then he leaned back, hands clasped over his stomach. "I wanted to talk about Dad's estate," he said. My chest tightened. I lowered the cup back to the saucer with deliberate calm. "It's mine by right," he continued. "That's how he would have wanted it. You'll be taken care of course. Just not through the will." The words were sharp, deliberate, like he'd practiced them, tasted them in his mouth before letting them out. I stared at him, trying to read the man sitting across from me. This was my son, the boy I'd stayed up nights sewing clothes for, the boy whose graduation photo still hung above my desk. Flashback, his high school ceremony. The gym was packed, the smell of fresh flowers mingling with warm stage lights. The sound of my own applause echoed in my ears as I watched him walk across the stage, tassel swinging, eyes bright with dreams. My heart felt full to breaking. Present, that same boy now looked at me as if I were a problem to solve. He stirred his coffee without meeting my eyes. "It's cleaner this way. Less complicated. You don't need the money. I'll make sure you have a place to live. Bills covered. Maybe some travel money." Travel money. As if a life's worth of sacrifice could be packaged into a holiday fund. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but my hands stayed steady on the cup. My mind was already reaching into the past. Flashback. The winter his father died. Snow piled high outside. The windows fogged from the weak heat inside. Me at the kitchen table, signing away my share of the estate, so my son would be secure. The lawyer's pen felt heavy, but I didn't read the fine print. I trusted him, like I trusted the sun to rise. Present. He looked up now, and I saw it, the satisfaction in delivering the blow. If I can help it, you won't get a penny from the will. It's nothing personal. Just practical, nothing personal. The café noise seemed to fade. All I could hear was the steady beat of my own heart, and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I set my cup down carefully. My voice stayed calm. I see, he nodded, relieved, mistaking my stillness for surrender. Good. I knew you'd understand. Understand. No, I understood something else entirely, that the boy I'd raised was gone. In his place sat a man who saw me not as a mother, but as an obstacle. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes travel over his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way he tilted his head slightly when he felt in control. I memorized every detail, because one day soon, I would see that expression break. Flashback. The day I sold my wedding necklace, the pawnbroker's shop smelled of metal and old wood. His hands were cold. As they took the necklace from me, my fingers felt lighter, emptier. The ache in my chest was heavier than the coins he dropped into my palm. Present. I stood, sliding my chair back. The legs scraped against the floor, the sound sharp enough to turn a few heads. The waitress glanced over, sensing the tension, but said nothing. He didn't look up, just checked his phone, already moving on from the conversation, as if it had been a minor errand. Outside the air was cool and damp. I breathed it in slowly, letting the cold settle my thoughts. My steps were steady, my hands loose at my sides. I wasn't angry, not anymore, because anger burns fast and leaves you empty. I needed something slower, colder, something he wouldn't see coming until it was too late. A plan. He thought this conversation was the end, but for me, it was the beginning. The day his father died, the world felt colder than it had any right to be. It was late winter. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that makes the daylight feel tired. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and wilted flowers. When they pulled the sheet over my husband's face, the sound of it sliding across the fabric was louder than anything else in the room. It was the sound of a chapter closing. I remember my son's hand in mine, small but tense. He was 17, old enough to understand the permanence of death, but still young enough to think his mother could shield him from anything. His fingers squeezed mine once, as if to anchor himself, before letting go to wipe his eyes. The days after blurred together. Phone calls, signatures, condolences delivered in hushed voices, and then came the meeting at the courthouse, the one that would change everything. The courthouse was an old building, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in pale winter light. The marble floor was so cold it seemed to seep through the soles of my shoes. Every footstep echoed as if the walls themselves were listening. We sat at a long oak table, papers spread out before us like a map of the rest of our lives. The lawyer spoke in clipped sentences, his voice bouncing off the walls. My share, his share, assets, liabilities, words that sounded hollow compared to the weight of what we had just lost. But all I could think about was the boy sitting beside me. He had lost his father. He was about to lose the safety he'd known his entire life. I couldn't let that happen. When the lawyer slid the documents toward me, the pen heavy in his hand, I didn't hesitate. I signed my name where he pointed, barely glancing at the words. I told myself it didn't matter what I gave up, as long as my son had security. Flashback within the flashback. I remembered the promises I'd whispered to him as a baby, that I would always make sure he had everything he needed, that nothing, not even tragedy, would take his future from him. Back in that courthouse, I squeezed his hand and told him the same thing out loud. He looked at me,
eyes glossy with grief, and nodded. The irony still burns. I wasn't just handing over my share of the estate. I was putting the future entirely in his hands. Hands I thought would protect me someday. When we left the courthouse, snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes. They clung to my coat and melted on my eyelashes. He walked ahead of me, shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the world had settled there. I followed, believing that weight would make him stronger, more compassionate. Years later, I would realize it only made him more certain he could stand without me. Present-day interruption. Last night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same pen I'd used years ago lying in front of me. The memory of its weight still lingered. It wasn't the pen that had betrayed me. It was my blind trust. Flashback continues. In the months after his father's death, I took extra shifts at the office to keep us afloat. I told my son the estate was tied up in legal processing, to explain why I never spent any of it on myself. In truth, I had already given it all to him, directly or indirectly. The property was in his name. The investments too. I remember paying the gas bill one night with the last $10 in my account, eating instant noodles for dinner so he could keep his gym membership. It seemed important then, to keep his routines normal, to make him feel like life hadn't shattered completely. The day the property title arrived in the mail, I held it in my hands for a long time. His name was printed in bold at the top, not ours, just his. I smiled, thinking I'd done the right thing, that someday he'd remember this moment, and understand the depth of my sacrifice. But as the years passed, I noticed something shift. Gratitude faded into expectation. Kindness turned into entitlement. Present day again. As I rinse my teacup, I can still feel the chill of that courthouse. I can still see the way my signature looped carelessly across the page, sealing my own exclusion. Back then, I thought sacrifice was a kind of armor, that the more I gave, the stronger our bond would become. But what I learned later is that sacrifice without boundaries becomes an invitation, and some people will take until there's nothing left. That courthouse day was supposed to secure my son's future. Instead, it set the stage for my betrayal, and one day soon, I would make sure it also became the foundation of his downfall. The house smelled the same the moment I stepped inside. Faint wood polish, and the mustiness of things left untouched for too long. It had been years since I set foot in the old family home. My husband's study was exactly as he'd left it. The heavy oak desk stood in the corner, papers stacked neatly, as if he might return any moment to finish reading them. Dust motes floated in the thin light that slipped through half-drawn curtains. I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was there for answers. My fingers trailed over the desk's surface, the wood cool beneath my skin. I pulled open drawers one by one. Pens, receipts, yellowing photographs. In the bottom drawer, hidden under an old leather-bound ledger, I found it, a small metal box, the kind that requires a key. It was coated in dust, the lock stiff with age. I set it on the desk, the metal scraping softly against the wood. The key was nowhere in sight. Flashback. I saw my husband years earlier, sliding that very box under the drawer. His hands were steady, his eyes calm. He'd always been a man of order, the kind who kept important things tucked away but never hidden from me. Back then, I thought I knew every secret in this house. Present, I searched the study until I found the key inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf. The lock clicked open with a reluctant snap. Inside, wrapped in yellowing tissue, was a stack of documents. The first page made my heart pound. Last will and testament of Daniel Carter. It was the original will, and in it my name was there side by side with my son's as equal beneficiaries. Every asset, every property, split between us. My hands trembled as I read the familiar handwriting of the witness signatures. This was the version I remembered discussing with my husband before he passed, but underneath it, clipped together, was another version. Cleaner paper, newer ink. My name was gone, The air in the room seemed to thin. My pulse roared in my ears. Flashback. I remembered sitting in the courthouse after his death signing papers without reading them, my son's hand on my arm, telling me it was just a formality, his voice gentle, reassuring. How easily I believed him. Present. The altered will was dated 6 months after Daniel's death. 6 months. I flipped to the last page, my eyes tracing the signatures. My husband's name, but the date didn't match. The ink looked darker, fresher, and the witness names were unfamiliar. A pit formed in my stomach. He had changed it after his father was gone. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate erasure. I sat back in the chair, the paper trembling in my hands. My mind replayed the conversation in the cafe, his calm, calculated words about protecting the inheritance. He hadn't been protecting anything but his own greed. I checked the rest of the box. Receipts, letters, a sealed envelope addressed to me in my husband's handwriting. My breath caught as I opened it. Inside was a short note written in the careful script I knew so well. If anything ever feels wrong, trust your instincts. This will is the truth. My throat tightened. He must have known something like this could happen. Or maybe he simply knew the people we love can surprise us in the worst ways. Flashback. A Sunday afternoon years ago, the three of us in this very room. My husband at the desk. My son sprawled in the armchair, teasing his father about being too organized. My husband laughed, saying, "One day all this will be yours, but never forget your mother's name is on it too." We all smiled. I thought it was a promise set in stone. Present.
The stone had cracked, and my son had taken a chisel to it. I placed the two wills side by side on the desk, the original with my name, the altered one without it. My hands stopped shaking. I wasn't looking at paper anymore. I was looking at evidence. The box went into my bag. Every document, every receipt, every scrap of handwriting, all of it. I wasn't sure yet how I'd use it, but I knew it was the first piece of the puzzle. I locked the study door behind me before leaving. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the storm I was about to unleash. Outside, the air was sharp, the sky threatening snow. I gripped my bag tighter. He thought I didn't have a way back in, but I'd just found the door, and soon I'd be the one holding the key. The documents from the metal box sat in a neat stack on my kitchen table. The lamplight turned the pages a soft gold, but the truth they held was anything but warm. I didn't rush. Revenge is never a sprint. It's a slow walk through every detail, every thread that can unravel the whole fabric. My first step was finding someone I could trust, and in my world now that was no small task. I called Evelyn Ward, a lawyer I'd met years ago when she handled a dispute for a neighbor. She had a reputation for quiet efficiency. No gossip, no leaks. When she agreed to meet, I felt the first anchor of certainty in weeks. Her office was exactly what I needed. Dark wood, shelves lined with legal books, the faint smell of ink and polish. I slid the two wills across her desk. She adjusted her glasses, reading line by line, her eyes narrowing slightly at the altered version. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady. "This is serious. If the second will was executed after your husband's death, and the signature is forged or coerced, you can challenge it. But you'll need proof. Solid proof." Flashback. I thought of the day I signed away my share without reading a word. My son's hand on my arm, the lawyer speaking quickly, my grief making every word sound like static. How easy it was to move me along, treating me like an afterthought. "Present. What kind of proof?" I asked. "Witnesses, financial records, anything that shows he acted in bad faith or altered documents without proper authority." She tapped the original will. "This is your foundation, but we'll need bricks to build the case." The next week became a careful dance between past and present. I started with Mrs. Blake, our old neighbor. She remembered the day of the courthouse signing. I thought it was strange your husband's friend wasn't there. He was supposed to be a witness, wasn't he? Her recollection went into my growing file. From there I visited Daniel's former business partner. He confirmed my husband had always intended an equal split. Said it was the only fair way, he told me, shaking his head when I showed him the altered will. Midweek, Evelyn called. I found something you need to see. At her office she laid out bank statements. 2 large transfers from an estate account to my son's personal account, dated weeks before the altered will was executed. I stared at the numbers. This wasn't just a legal violation, it was theft in motion. Flashback. I remembered the months after Daniel's death, cutting coupons, stretching meals, paying bills late, while my son always seemed strangely unconcerned about money. He had new clothes, dinners out with friends. Now I knew why. Present. We moved fast after that. Evelyn contacted both original witnesses to the will. Each signed a sworn statement confirming they had only ever witnessed the first version, the one with my name. I spent late nights cross-checking every transaction in the estate's history. I found smaller withdrawals too, all lining up with the weeks leading up to the altered will. Piece by piece, the picture was coming together, a picture of greed, planned and deliberate. One evening, I spread all the evidence across my dining table. Bank statements, witness affidavits, copies of both wills. The pages rustled in the stillness, a quiet chorus of truth waiting to be spoken. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, but inside I felt something I hadn't in a long time: control. The next morning, Evelyn and I met again. She placed a 1-page summary in front of me. This is enough to file a formal challenge. Once we do, his accounts could be frozen, and he'll be served notice. I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper. This was the threshold. Once I stepped over, there would be no returning to silence, no pretending the betrayal never happened. Evelyn watched me closely. "If you're ready to go through with this," she said quietly, "there's no turning back." I met her gaze. Good, because I had no intention of turning back. The dining room buzzed with the sound of voices, cutlery, and champagne flutes clinking together. The long table was dressed in crisp white linen, the air perfumed with roasted lamb, garlic, and fresh herbs. Candles flickered in tall holders, throwing soft light across the faces of everyone I had once called family. It was supposed to be a celebration. My son's promotion, his growing investments, his new chapter. That's what the engraved invitations had said. I hadn't wanted to come, but refusing would have given him the satisfaction of thinking I couldn't face him. I took a seat near the middle of the table. My place card had been positioned between a distant cousin and one of his business partners, not next to him, not even close. The room felt warm, almost stifling. Conversations overlapped, laughter rose and fell like waves. I kept my eyes on my plate, eating quietly, until I heard his spoon tapping against his glass. The sound cut through the chatter. Everyone turned to him. He stood, tall and confident, holding his glass high. His suit was perfectly tailored, his smile sharp enough to cut. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Tonight isn't just about my promotion, it's about the future I'm building, a future without the baggage of the past." His eyes found mine and stayed there. A few people laughed. A few more glanced between us, understanding the barb. The words landed like a slap. I couldn't block. I sat very still, my fork hovering above my plate. Flashback. Years earlier, a different table. My son at 16, sulking over a failed exam. I sat across from him, telling him that failures weren't the end, that we could always start over, that the past didn't have to chain him. I didn't know those words would one day be twisted into a weapon against me. Present. He sipped his drink, pausing for effect. We move forward by letting go of what holds us back, and I, for one, am ready to make sure the future is clean, clear, and mine to shape. Laughter rippled around the table again, louder this time. A few raised their glasses. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes that didn't meet mine, the kind of silence that says more than words. The clink of crystal was deafening. I forced a polite smile, the kind that hides the tremor in your chest. Flashback. The year after his father died,
I had emptied my savings to help him start his first business venture. I worked double shifts so he could rent a decent office space. The day he signed his first client, he hugged me and told me none of it would have been possible without me. Present. Now he spoke as if I were a shadow, something to be erased. Dinner resumed, but the food tasted like ash. Every laugh, every casual comment around me felt like it belonged to a room I wasn't in. I was sitting there, but I was invisible. I glanced down the table at him. He was leaning toward a colleague, smiling easily, his hand resting on the back of his new girlfriend's chair. She laughed at something he whispered, touching his arm, like they shared a private victory, and maybe they did. The rest of the night passed in a blur of clinking glasses and hollow congratulations. I said little. No one seemed to notice. When dessert was served, I excused myself early, claiming I wasn't feeling well. No one protested, not even him. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, sharp and bracing. My heels clicked against the stone walkway, the sound echoing in the empty street. By the time I reached my car, my hands had stopped shaking. My heart, however, had settled into a new rhythm, steady, deliberate. This wouldn't be just about taking back what was mine. That night at the table, watching him bask in applause built on lies and betrayal, I realized something. Legal revenge would strip him of money and property, but public revenge, that would strip him of the one thing he valued more, the image he had built of himself. The man who prided himself on being untouchable in front of others was going to fall where everyone could see, and I would make sure of it. The envelope was thinner than I expected. Evelyn slid it across her desk toward me, her eyes steady. "This is it," she said. Inside was a simple 3-page document, the formal legal challenge to the will. Once filed, it would trigger a freeze on key accounts and block any property transfers until the case was resolved. A quiet move, clean, surgical. I signed it without hesitation. My hand didn't shake. My voice didn't catch. The pen glided over the page as easily as it had years ago in that courthouse. But this time, I knew exactly what I was doing. Flashback. That first signing, when grief blurred my vision and trust made me blind. My son's reassuring hand on mine. The warm, false comfort of believing he was protecting me. Present. Now, I was the one holding the knife, and I intended to use it with precision. The next morning, Evelyn confirmed the filing was complete. The freeze took effect within hours. Quietly, without warning, the flow of money stopped. Accounts he used daily were suddenly inaccessible. I didn't call him. I didn't gloat. I went about my day as if nothing had happened, watering my plants, folding laundry, making tea. Revenge tastes better when you savor the silence before the reaction. It didn't take long. 3 days later, the door to my house swung open with a force that rattled the hinges. His footsteps stormed across the hardwood, each one heavy, deliberate. I was in the kitchen, pouring tea, when his voice cut through the air like broken glass. "What did you do?" I turned slowly, holding the cup steady. He stood there, jaw tight, the court notice crumpled in his fist. His suit jacket hung open, his tie loose, like he'd come straight from a meeting he didn't want to be in. He slammed the paper onto the counter. "My accounts are frozen. I can't move anything. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I met his glare with a calm he couldn't touch. "It's just business." For a moment, he looked confused, then angry. His hands curled into fists. "Business? You're trying to destroy me." Flashback. The winter I sold my last piece of jewelry to keep the mortgage paid. Him, sitting in the living room, never asking where the money came from, only assuming it would always be there. Present. I took a slow sip of tea. "You'll manage." His voice rose. "You think this will work? You think you can scare me?" I set the cup down gently. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just protecting what's mine." The words hung in the air, heavier than the steam curling from the kettle. Suspense checkpoint. For the first time I saw it, the flicker of doubt in his eyes, not fear, not yet, but the first crack in the certainty he wore like armor. He grabbed the notice off the counter, crumpling it further, and turned toward the door. "You're making a mistake. You have no idea what you've started. I let him go without another word. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames. When the house was quiet again, I walked back to the table, where my files lay neatly stacked. Bank records, witness statements, the original will, all in order, all ready for the next step. I knew he would spend the next few days scrambling, calling his lawyers, trying to find loopholes, reassuring himself he could outmaneuver me. What he didn't know was that the freeze was only the first thread I planned to pull. Once you start unraveling a fabric, the rest comes apart faster than anyone expects. Flashback. The night after his father's funeral, when he'd sat in the study pretending to work while I paid the funeral costs from my own savings. He never thanked me. He never even asked if I had enough left to get by. Present. That night, I sat by the window with a notebook and a pen, outlining the next phase. Public exposure would come later. For now, I wanted him off balance, distracted, doubting himself. My phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn. He's already called my office twice. You've got his attention. Good. Attention was the first step toward panic, and panic leads to mistakes. I closed the notebook, the plan for the next move already forming in my mind. The first strike had landed, and the second would be impossible for him to hide from. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a scent that carried the weight of decisions no one could undo. Rows of benches stretched behind me, already filling with relatives, former friends and people from the community who had heard whispers of the case. I could feel their eyes on me as I took my seat beside Evelyn. I kept my back straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Across the aisle, my son sat flanked by his attorney. He looked immaculate, tailored suit, crisp white shirt, but his jaw was tight, and his eyes kept darting to the door as if he wished there were a way out. The judge entered, the murmur of the crowd fading into silence. Papers shuffled, the air was still, almost heavy. Evelyn rose first, laying out the foundation of the case with a calm precision that made every word cut deeper. She presented the original will, the one with my name as co-beneficiary, side by side with the altered version. The difference was stark, not just in content, but in intent. She pointed to the date on the second will, signed months after my husband's death, and then to the signatures, darker ink, inconsistent strokes, no witnesses from the original execution. Gasps rippled through the room when she produced sworn statements from the original witnesses, both confirming they had never been called back to sign another document. Flashback. The day I discovered the metal box in my husband's study, the dust on the lock, the way my hands trembled when I opened it, my husband's note telling me to trust my instincts. Present, Evelyn continued, sliding bank statements across the table for the judge to see. Large transfers from the estate account to my son's personal account weeks before the altered will was executed. Each transaction date appeared on the screen projected for the court, numbers glaring in black and white. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Even his lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Suspense checkpoint. I watched my son's face as Evelyn read the timeline aloud. The funeral, the transfers, the courthouse signing. His confident mask faltered, just slightly, when the second witness affidavit was read. His fingers tapped against his knee, faster and faster. Then Evelyn stepped back from the podium and delivered the line I would remember for the rest of my life. This was not a son protecting his future. This was a man robbing his mother. The words dropped into the air like a stone into still water, sending silent ripples through every row. My son's lawyer tried to recover, arguing technicalities, questioning memory, suggesting the original will had been updated in good faith, but each rebuttal crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Flashback. The night he told me in the cafe that I wouldn't see a penny from the inheritance. The way the steam from my tea had blurred my vision, just enough to hide the fire building inside me. Present. When closing statements ended, the judge leaned forward, hands clasped. His voice was measured, but firm as he addressed the court. In reviewing the evidence, it is clear that the second will was executed under questionable circumstances and contains multiple irregularities inconsistent with standard legal procedure. This court finds that the original will is the valid document of record. The decision landed like a gavel before the actual one struck. All assets and properties are to be restored to the original distribution, he continued, with immediate effect. Gasps, whispers, a few heads turning toward me, some with approval, others with disbelief. I didn't move. I didn't smile. My son sat frozen, pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. His eyes were locked on the papers in front of him, as if not looking at me could make me disappear. The gavel struck. The case was closed. As people began to stand, I felt the air shift. It wasn't just victory, it was exposure. In one public moment, the carefully curated image my son had built cracked. No one would see him the same way again. Flashback. Years earlier, him at his college graduation, smiling at the crowd as if the world already belonged to him. Back then, I thought that smile was ambition. Now, I knew it was entitlement. Present. The bailiff collected documents. The murmurs swelled. My son's lawyer packed his briefcase without a word. I stood, smoothing my jacket, and walked out without looking back. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse, reporters calling my name. I didn't stop to answer. I didn't need to. The real statement had already been made. Inside, under oath, in front of everyone who mattered. The assets were mine again. But the real victory was that he could never erase what had just happened. His downfall had a witness list, and soon, the next phase of my plan would make sure the echo of this day never faded. The first night back in the family home, I walked through every room in silence. The renovations had brought it back to life. Polished floors, fresh paint, the faint scent of cedar from the newly built cabinets. The light fixtures glowed warmly, chasing away the shadows that had lingered since the day my husband died. It no longer felt like a house holding its breath. It felt like it could finally exhale. I stood in the study, running my hand over the smooth surface of the oak desk. This was where I had found the box, where the truth had started to come back to me piece by piece. Now, it was mine again, not because it had been handed to me, but because I had taken it back. Flashback. The night after the court ruling, walking out past the flashing cameras, the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made pressing against me, and for the first time in years it didn't feel like a burden, it felt like armor. Present. I sat at the desk and opened a new folder. Inside were documents for the charitable trusts I had set up that week, the same causes my husband had quietly supported his whole life. Scholarships for underprivileged students, a community center renovation, a small grant program for local farmers. Every project carried his name. The money wasn't just moving, it was moving with purpose. I had also set aside a trust for my grandchildren. Not a cent of it would pass through my son's hands. Their futures would be secure without the poison of his greed. When the lawyers had asked if I wanted to send him formal notice, I had declined. Let him find out through the same whispers he used to control others. Some messages are stronger when they arrive in the mouths of strangers. Flashback. Years earlier, Daniel and I in the same study, laughing, as we made a list of charities we wanted to support one day. I had tucked the list away, thinking we'd have decades to make it happen. Present. It was happening now, and it was happening without compromise. The weeks after the trial passed quietly. I walked in the garden every morning, the air cool against my skin, the sound of sparrows filling the space where my thoughts used to ache. People in town stopped me on the street, some to congratulate me, some just to say they had been watching and silently cheering me on. I didn't tell them that the real victory wasn't the money or the property. It was the look on my son's face in that courtroom when he realized the truth couldn't be buried. Suspense checkpoint. 2 weeks after moving in, a letter arrived. No return address, no signature, just a single sentence written in handwriting. I knew well, "You've made your point." I didn't reply. The point had been made the moment the gavel came down. Everything after that was just echo. One afternoon, I stood on the front porch watching the sun sink behind the trees. The house was quiet. but not empty. The walls didn't hold grief anymore. They held resolve. Flashback. The younger me, hunched over a sewing machine late at night, fingers raw, eyes heavy, telling myself it was worth it. That one day, all the work, all the giving, would mean something. Present. It meant something now, not in the way I once imagined, but in a way that was sharper, cleaner. Revenge had never been the real goal. This was reclamation, taking back my name from the edges of legal documents, taking back my dignity from whispered jokes at dinner tables, taking back my place in a family legacy I had helped build from the ground up. The house behind me stood as proof. The charities in motion stood as proof. The trust for my grandchildren stood as proof. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his apology. I only needed to know that the future, my future, was once again in my hands. The last light of the day spilled across the porch. I turned to go inside, closing the door softly behind me. Some endings burn everything down. The best ones rebuild. Some people believe family is defined by blood alone. I used to believe that too, but the truth is simple and sharper than most are willing to admit. Blood makes you related. Respect makes you family. Everything I fought for wasn't about greed or revenge for its own sake. It was about reclaiming what should never have been taken, about standing up when someone you love decides your worth is negotiable, because once you allow disrespect to stay at the table, it will eat everything you've built, piece by piece, until you're left with nothing but regret. I chose to protect what mattered, even when it meant breaking the image of family I'd carried for years, and if I had to, I would do it again. If it were you, would you have done the same? Tell me in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe dignity is worth fighting for, subscribe. There are more stories you need to hear.